Let's talk about what we're going to be covering in this stream. First, I'm going to introduce the idea of this age of revolution and what we mean by it. Then we're going to talk about the roots of these Atlantic revolutions. I'm going to focus really on trying to situate it within an intellectual movement, the Enlightenment, which you may have learned about, and then also think about it from a little bit of a global perspective and maybe some events that are going on globally that lead to these revolutions. And also think about how those roots are manifested in some of our most important written documents that come out of this revolution. Then we'll go over our overviews of these Atlantic revolutions. Hopefully I won't get too much in the weeds. My goal is not to give you the ins and outs of every little bit of these Atlantic revolutions, but instead to give you kind of a broad understanding of maybe what leads to it, how it started, maybe some important people and outcomes, along with those effects. And then we'll get into some practice with these reviews. So anyways, let's get started. Let's go ahead and we're going to start thinking about this age of revolution and introducing this idea. So the first thing I want to think about is in this unit, at least the way the College Board is divided, kind of our history, our time in this kind of modern colonial era, 1750 to 1900. We have a lot of revolutions going on. You know, you have the Industrial Revolution, I'm sure that some of you will be learning about pretty soon. But these revolutions that we're talking about are more of the political revolutions. In around 1750 in the Atlantic world, keep in mind on one side of the Atlantic, you have Europe, right? These European countries that are rising in power, controlling large colonial territories in the Americas and expanding their reach beyond the Americas into the Indian Ocean. In 1750, remember that Spain is the largest landholder in the Americas, controlling nearly all of South America and Central and America and Mexico, southwestern, what will become the southwestern United States. France has a sizable empire in Louisiana and Canada, and Britain also controls portions of Canada and the Americas. And of course, there's a smattering of islands, and we can't forget Portugal with controlling Brazil. But the Atlantic world was European dominated, and it was the site of a great deal of trade in this time period. Remember, the Atlantic system, the Atlantic trade network will become the dominant, or will be the dominant trade network. So lots of goods moving back and forth from Europe to the Americas, lots of raw materials moving from the Americas to the rest of the world. We also have the slave trade, which is quite significant in this era, as slaves are pouring into South America and the Caribbean and North America in order to grow cash crops for the most part. We think about sugar cane is the primary of these crops, and tobacco as well is significant, but also other things like indigo. Eventually, as we get into the 1800s, cotton becomes much more important with the Industrial Revolution. So we have this Atlantic world reliant on trade, certainly reliant on this connection of Europeans with their colonies not only being a source of raw materials, but also markets for the sale of goods. And we also have these colonies really, in some ways, at least if you see it from the perspective of the American colonists, the 13 original colonies, they are kind of restricted in what they can trade. In this time period, we're dealing with an economic system of mercantilism, which was valued a great deal by these European countries, where colonies were restricted to trade only with their motherlands. And that will lead to some disagreement, especially with the American Revolution. Now, in the Atlantic world, thinking about whether it be in Europe or the Americas, we're also talking about a world that is dominated by the elite. In the Americas, it is an elite planter class. That is, if you're thinking about the 13 colonies, it's these large plantation owners, these wealthy merchants, perhaps in the Northeast, but in places like Virginia, large plantation owners. You can think of Jefferson, Washington as examples of those. In Latin America, we're dealing with Spanish peninsulares or Creole classes, again, large landowning, wealthy, educated classes of people. And it is those classes which are going to lead these revolutions. Now, back in France, which is the one revolution we're going to be talking about that's not in the Americas today, the French Revolution was dealing with the same thing. You had a growing wealthy middle class. We call them the bourgeoisie. And they found, like a lot of people in the Americas, that even though they were growing in wealth and influence in some ways, economically perhaps, they were not seeing political rights being protected or they were not having a say in politics. And so these revolutions really become attempts to gain political power by a class that did not have it. In the Americas, you have these classes that are literally see themselves as second-class citizens to Europeans, to their mother countries. In fact, Simón Bolívar will liken their position to slaves, although maybe the slaves of Haiti would disagree because they were actually enslaved for their revolution. But in France, of course, you have this bourgeoisie who's looking for a political say in their government. And so out of this Atlantic world, we're going to see the drive for these political rights. It'll be colonial discontent in America, in North America and Latin America, and it will be class discontent or class warfare, we might want to say, back in France. By 1830, though, the Atlantic world will look much different. France will have gone through several transformations. Britain will have lost control of the American colonies, although not all of their colonies in the Americas. They still will control a good deal of Caribbean islands. They will control Canada still for some time. France will be booted out of North America. They will lose their colony of Haiti. They will lose a lot of land in North America in the 7 Years' War, and then eventually, after gaining Louisiana for a short period, they will sell that to the United States. Latin American countries, pretty much all of South America, Central America, Mexico, they become independent by 1830, and we'll see kind of just a major transformation in what the Americas look like. And it's all happening in a span of, revolutions really kicking off around 1775 with the American Revolution. So we're talking here about 55 years or so, quite a transformation going to take place. And that's a lot of background, I know. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to chime in and ask them, because we're going to now kind of move on to our second phase now that we've set kind of a context for these revolutions, and think about, what that really influenced the thinking that came to these revolutions, or that brought about these revolutions. And the first kind of root of these Atlantic revolutions that I want to talk about, went too far there, is the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment, or Age of Reason, really is an intellectual movement. We might consider it an intellectual revolution that begins late early 1700s and carries throughout this time period. This intellectual revolution really grew out of the scientific revolution, which you may have studied. The scientific revolution sought to use reason and logic and the scientific method to arrive at answers to the problems of trying to figure out issues in the natural world, maybe solving problems in the natural world as well. Now, the Enlightenment took those same principles, logic and reason, and they began to think not just about what was going on in the natural world, but how society worked, and trying to think about what were the problems in society, what were the problems economically, politically, socially, and how could reason and logic be used to perhaps solve those problems. And so this intellectual revolution really starts by questioning traditional beliefs and practices, questioning why there is a king, why people have a king, why certain people have rights and certain people don't. Really starting to question, is that the best way of government? What is the best way to govern? Where does the power of government come from? Those are the types of questions that these Enlightenment thinkers begin to ask, and they're not brand new. The Enlightenment thinkers saw themselves as kind of the the heirs of Greek and Roman philosophy, right? Kind of Greco-Roman classical traditions, and in fact, the styles of art, like you see here, the styles of architecture, begin to be known as neoclassical or new classical era, as Enlightenment thinkers really saw themselves picking up the philosophy of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and carrying it on and trying to think about those same things, applying logic and reason to the world around them. So this intellectual revolution comes about, and out of it comes some of the most important thinkers of modern Western philosophy. And so we're going to talk a little bit about these thinkers, and they're what I call must-know thinkers. In fact, the key concepts in the past named for specific thinkers. And so I'm going to go through those and just give you a kind of a brief rundown of what they said, what the ideas they put forth, and we'll make some connections going forward of how those influenced these revolutions. So the first person that you definitely need to know, you can see in the top left here of this image, and this is John Locke. So John Locke is particularly noteworthy because among many different philosophical developments or writings that he had, John Locke posited that all humans have what he called natural rights. This idea that every person, by nature of their being born, had certain rights that should not be infringed upon or taken away by anyone. He called those rights life, the right to life, the right to liberty, a certain freedom, and property. Now, Thomas Jefferson is going to take those words and paraphrase them in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of the Rights of Man, largely written by the Marquis de Lafayette, will paraphrase them in a different way. But this idea that humans are born with rights, and that is that all men have these rights in a way that might be different than the way things were seen in the past. In the past, depending on your birthright, depending on your bloodline and whether or not you were born to nobility or to the peasant class, that often determined what rights you had. But Locke challenges that idea. And beyond that, he says that it's the government's responsibility to protect those rights of the people. He also comes up with this idea, thinking about where does government's power come from? He says it comes from the consent of the governed, that it is the people themselves who give power to the government, that it comes from the people, not from some top down, but from the bottom up. Now, Locke likely wouldn't have said that it maybe came from peasants. He may have, a lot of these early Enlightenment thinkers did kind of pump the brakes on the idea of just the masses running wild and controlling government. Oftentimes they were referring to an educated bourgeois class or planter class that had not really had a say in government to that point. But nevertheless, this was a major change in how people began to think about government. And so these ideas start to spread, right? They're kind of batted around between different Enlightenment thinkers. And what we see are some people take those ideas and they run with them. The guy in the that you see there with the fantastic wig in the bottom left is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a French Enlightenment thinker, and he believed that government was formed, and the people came together with the government and formed a contract. He basically likened this relationship between the government and people to a contract. So it's called social contract theory. In fact, his book was called The Social Contract. And what he basically said was that there are responsibilities that each side have toward each other, and that if the government does not protect the rights of the people or infringes upon the rights of people, then they can break that contract and reform it. And so these ideas that come from Locke and Rousseau really lay the groundwork and the justifications for some revolutions that will be occurring. Other things that come out of the Enlightenment, the top right there, you see a guy named Voltaire. That's his pen name. He began writing, and he was somebody who he's kind of like the Stephen Colbert of his day with satire, and he would impugn absolutist governments that especially those found in France and those of Europe, everywhere outside of Europe. And in this satire, and I see a question about what I mean by that. When we think about what satire is, it is basically the use of humor, irony, ridicule, exaggeration to expose a position that you disagree with, maybe to try to expose the idiocy or stupidity of another person's point of view. And so oftentimes we see this in like plays or novels where they might kind of exaggerate a point of view and even maybe pretend to go along and agree with it, really to just show how indefensible it might be. So Voltaire did this by, for example, attacking the Catholic Church with this satire, with his writings. He was a big believer that religion was of course, across the history of Europe, people believe that religion had caused a lot of the problems that Europe was seeing. He's thinking critically about, why there were wars for, following the Reformation. And he's saying that it is when religion and the government come together that we see oppression and the maybe infringing on people's rights. So he was a big believer in freedom of religion, freedom of speech, definitely kind of a very influential thinker in this time, although writing about it maybe in a little different ways than everybody else. The guy in the bottom right here, the Baron de Montesquieu, a Frenchman, and he posits that he's thinking the same thing. Right? Where does the power of government come from? What is the government that governs best? And he really looks at the British example and he says, well, Britain to a certain extent has a limited power of government. They had a king, but they also had parliament. So they had some separation of powers. And he was thinking, well, what are the powers of government? The power to make laws, legislate, the power to enforce laws, executive, and the power to carry out punishments or determine constitutionality, and that would be the judicial powers. He says that whenever those powers were held under one branch, you had the recipe for tyranny. And so the best thing, he said, was to separate those powers. You may kind of already be thinking, well, that sounds a lot like American government, and it is. These ideas of Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Voltaire, they do form the basis for what we'll call the American experiment later on, which is the United States and its founding documents were deeply rooted in the Enlightenment. Speaking of documents, I want to get everybody chiming in this poll. Let's see what you can, or in this in your chat. I have a question for you before we go on and talk about some of these influences on revolutionary documents. So here's your challenge question. All of the following documents were influenced by the intellectual movements known as the Enlightenment, except. Which of these documents? Go ahead and put in the chat A, B, C, or D. Which of these was not influenced by the Enlightenment? All right, let's see. Got a couple answers, Ching Long and Judy. I hope I'm not murdering your names there, but I want to give you a shout out for popping a question in and taking a stab at this one. All right, so here we have the options: Declaration of Independence, Jamaica Letter, Magna Carta, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Well, the Declaration of Independence declared independence for the United States. The Jamaica Letter, not a letter of a Declaration of Independence or a statement of independence, but a letter really outlining the argument for independence from Simón Bolívar. And so it was also influenced by the Enlightenment. And the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, coming from the French Revolution. The correct answer here is C, the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is a document that is highly influential, especially in limiting the power of the British monarchy, but it was created way back in 1215, so it predated the Enlightenment. Although perhaps maybe set up the situation that influenced later Enlightenment thinkers. So maybe the other way around. But let's talk about the A, B, and D here and think about the influence of these Enlightenment documents. So these ideas, the Enlightenment, why am I spending so much time on this? I know you're thinking, let's get to these revolutions. It's because these ideas really do have an effect on the leaders and the thinking of the leaders of these independence movements. They really do. They're wealthy, they're educated, they are reading these documents, and they're beginning to think about how these challenges to the status quo that are coming out of the Enlightenment apply to their situations, and how their rights, as they felt, were being violated by these colonial governments, or in France's case, by a despotic absolutist government. So let's look at some examples. Here's an excerpt from the Declaration of Independence, and we're not going to read the whole thing, but I've highlighted in each of these three examples influences that the Enlightenment had on these. So from the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, right? Those natural rights in which Jefferson refers to as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it says that the governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed. And both of those ideas, life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, consent of the governed, are ideas that come about with John Locke. And whenever a government becomes destructive, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. So in this Declaration of Independence, basically these leaders of the United States are saying, all right, if we're going to break away from England, we have to explain why we are declaring independence, right? We can't just say, oh, we're not going to be a part of you anymore. No, we need to lay out our argument, lay out the philosophy behind it. And that philosophy is deeply rooted in this Enlightenment. Now, the French Revolution is a little bit different because the revolution begins there, and they are as we'll talk about later, it's led by a bourgeois class, kind of an upper middle class that had very little say in government. In fact, really no power compared to the other estates in France. And the Donald checking in. All right. Thank you, Donald. Revolution's great topic. I've also let people know about your chat tomorrow. If anybody has questions about the live session that Donald will be running tomorrow, throw it in the chat right now. Maybe he can answer you. All right. So going back to this Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, this document comes out of a not necessarily an idea of declaring why they're breaking away, because France was restarting their government, basically overthrowing it and establishing a new government in its place. But they decided that, well, they needed to formally declare what are the rights that they believe that all Frenchmen should have. And so I pulled out a few excerpts here that show, again, that influence of the Enlightenment. And there are many more. There's 17 total articles in this Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and most of them are heavily influenced by the Enlightenment, even some that deal with the way people should be punished for crimes, which come from some other influences like Cesar Beccaria, etc. Article 1, right up front, ideas of John Locke. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions founded only upon the general good. Again, this idea of natural rights from birth, not dependent on whether or not you're born to a noble class or not. And it names these what they call natural and imprescriptible rights of man: liberty, property, security, resistance to oppression. Those are the terms that the French use for those natural rights as they enumerate them. Article 6, law is the expression of the general will, right? Every citizen has the right to participate in this, right? So again, getting at that idea of where does the power of government come from? Here, it's an expression of the populace, of the people. And then later on, ideas of Voltaire: free communication of ideas and opinion is one of the most precious rights of man. Again, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, which is mentioned in another one of these articles, actually in Article 10, I think, which I removed here. But right, they can speak, write, print with freedom, free from any abuses of these rights. And so these ideas are present in the United States when the revolution comes. They're present in France when the revolution comes, and they're present in Latin America. Simón Bolívar, the leader of the great South American revolutions, he, in his Jamaica letter, while he is briefly exiled to the British island of Jamaica, writes this letter to the governor of Jamaica, the British governor of Jamaica, maybe looking for support. And he lays out his arguments for independence and why they are feeling oppressed by Spain at this point. And again, that connection we saw earlier to slavery. A people is therefore enslaved when the government, by its nature or its vices, infringes on and usurps the rights of the citizen or subject. Again, those Enlightenment ideas: people have rights, government should protect them, not undermine them. He even here quotes in another section, he quotes the Baron de Montesquieu. It may not necessarily specifically about the separation of powers, but another one of Montesquieu's writings. He says, "It is harder," Montesquieu has written, "to release a nation from servitude than to enslave a free nation." So again, going to these very significant, well-known Enlightenment thinkers. And again, he desired to see America, meaning South America, these South American nations, fashioned into the greatest nation in the world. Greatest not so much by virtue of her area and wealth as by her freedom and glory, right? Establishing an independent country that is based on protection of freedoms. All of these ideas coming out of the Enlightenment, really shaping these Atlantic revolutions. All right. These three documents that I've gone over here with you, the Declaration of Independence, Declaration of the Rights of Man, Simón Bolívar's Jamaica letter, those are documents that you should be familiar enough with that if you were to see them in a multiple choice question or in an SAQ or in a DBQ, you would know those connections to the Enlightenment and to these revolutions. Those are three extremely important documents. You may read them in your classes. I know in my classes I have an activity where students read them and then they go through and pick out these Enlightenment influences themselves. But the Jamaica letter is a little bit longer, so there's a lot of parts of it. It might be a little bit more difficult, but definitely maybe take a look at them, get familiar with some of these. There's some really great sites online also that offer annotated versions of them. To help kind of deal with the more difficult language. So if we think about this, then, all right, that's kind of the Enlightenment portion. I know you're thinking, all right, where do we go from there? Well, the Enlightenment really isn't the only root of these Atlantic revolutions. Remember that I said that there is definitely a kind of there are global shifts happening in these Atlantic revolutions. So it's important to also know the global context. For example, with the American Revolution and the French Revolution, an important context is the 7 Years' War, which was pretty much kind of a global war. Some have gone back, some historians have gone back and kind of referred to it as the First World War before World Wars happened. And but the 7 Years' War occurs back in the late 1750s, early 1760s. And it's a war that between Great Britain and France primarily, and their allies around the world, including their colonies. And so this war brought in a lot of resources around the world, fought over territory around the world, particularly in North America, in what we in the United States typically refer to as the French and Indian War. But it was one part or one theater of the 7 Years' War in which Great Britain, the American colonists, and their allies fought against France, French colonists, and their Native American allies in a war that ultimately Great Britain wins to gain control of North America. Some islands exchange hands, some control of trade in South Asia. But this 7 Years' War is an extremely costly war. In fact, trying to pay off the costs of the war is one of the reasons why Great Britain starts to tax American colonists, leading to their dissatisfaction and eventually their revolution. It is something that puts France deep in debt, which not maybe the main debt that really contributes to their revolution, but it does kind of set them back somewhat. Later on, they will loan more money to the United States in their revolution against Great Britain, and that will cause France some pain as their treasury is mismanaged by their government, and that sparks again a need to raise taxes in France, which then leads to the French Revolution. Also, I want you to think about the fact that this revolution these revolutions are not in isolation. They don't occur without really, oh, this revolution happened here and then this revolution happened here and they had nothing to do with each other. That's actually not the case. In fact, we might be able to see these revolutions as a sort of chain reaction. The American Revolution was extremely influential, and by American, I mean the United States, the Revolution was extremely influential in sparking even the idea and that revolutions by these colonies could be won against these major European powers. Really and truly, the idea that these little colonies could beat massive armies and navies of France and England would seem to be quite foreign until the United States does it. And then, the Spanish colonies begin to think about it. France looks at the example of the American Revolution as throwing off kind of oppressive regimes. And so they look at their own absolutist government and try to find a way to correct that issue. And as Donald correctly says over here in the chat, we see that kind of that ripple effect. Exactly. I think that's a really great way to phrase it. You have this American Revolution influencing the French Revolution. The French Revolution kind of events there, creating enough chaos for the Haitian Revolution to happen. Haitian Revolution also looking toward the United States as influence, as a model for the revolution, a slave revolt that is successful, and then of course Latin American revolutions afterwards. And so from the late 1700s with the United States Revolution from 1775 to 1783, I think is when the treaty is signed. You have that occurring at the end of 1700s. The early 1800s, Haiti becomes independent. By the 1820s, at least by 1830, all of Latin America has thrown off Spanish rule. Remember that in all of these places, revolutionaries are looking at examples of what everybody else did. So keep that context in mind as well when we think about causes of these. The last thing that I would throw in here is the Napoleonic Wars. It throws a lot of stuff into question. It actually provides an opportunity for some of these revolutions to occur. In fact, Bolivar's revolutions, the revolutions in Haiti, and then which led by not Bolivar, and then the revolution in South America by Bolivar, are really touched off by what's going on in France. What was called the Peninsular War, when Napoleon invades the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal, and Spain. That really throws Latin America into this period of flux and really kind of opens the door and the opportunity for successful revolution. All right. That's a lot of background. We got to get talking about these revolutions and exactly what happened. I know that's probably what you're here for, but I think what we've gone through so far is pretty important. Let's look at another question here. Which of the following incorrectly pairs the revolution with the colonial power it opposed? Throw it up in the chat. Throw your answer up there. I'll give shout outs to the first correct answer. A, B, C, or D. Mexican Revolution in Spain, American Revolution, Britain, Latin American Wars for Independence, Spain, Haitian Revolution, Britain. Which is incorrect? Give you a minute. I know there's a little bit of lag. I don't want to ruin it for everybody. You can hear my voice is getting hoarse, but I'm in for the long haul tonight, folks. We will get through this. So let's get some chatter in this chat. I think all of you will find that as we get further and further into the year, you're going to get to see people again and again in these, which gets really exciting when we kind of build that community. So really excited for you to be here. Also want to remind you, invite your friends to these. It's always better to have somebody who's kind of in it with you. Feel free to take a look at what we have going forward, and consider which ones you might be interested in. So so let's go ahead. Correct answer, Ching Long. Awesome job. D is the correct answer here. D is the correct answer. The Mexican Revolution was a revolution from Spain, as were the Latin American Wars for Independence. The American Revolution from Britain. For the Haitian Revolution, Haiti breaks away from France, which is pretty interesting. So let's talk about these revolutions. I'm going to go through them again very quickly. Again, this is meant to be kind of a larger overview. And I do think really focusing on the causes and the background are kind of where it's at. You're not going to be asked particularly about specific battles or something in the American Revolution. That's not something you need to worry about, but we will kind of go over the main information here. So first, we'll start with kind of the first one of these Atlantic revolutions. That is the revolution found in the United States, which has its roots, like I said, in that 7 Years' War, what was called the French and Indian War. After that war, the United States or Britain defeats France and controls a great deal of land all the way to the Mississippi River. American colonists see an opportunity. They want to expand westward and begin farming out in the West. However, Britain is going broke trying to defend these colonists. And while the colonists feel, hey, we fought for this land, we should be able to settle it, Britain doesn't think so. Britain is thinking in terms of how much it's going to cost to defend these colonists. And they also believe that they've run up quite a war tab. And so I began to tax these American colonists. And there's a series of acts that tax things like tea and sugar and paper, even with the Stamp Act. And this angers the colonists quite a bit. These colonists organize boycotts and protests, and they dump tea into Boston Harbor at the Boston Tea Party. And Britain responds with even more restrictions, especially restrictions on American trade. And now with where Americans can buy goods from and who they can sell them to. Well, of course, Americans who previously had not had to deal with these restrictions, or at least where these restrictions had not been enforced up until that time, felt that their right to prosper was being infringed upon. And so they eventually kind of organized protests against the British government, which at times break out into violence. One being the Boston Massacre, another a skirmish, which really is seen as the first battle of the war, Lexington and Concord. And so this revolution starts to develop into a war. Eventually, in 1776, the United States declares independence from Britain. But it will be 7 years before the war is over and a treaty signed that formally recognizes the split. And once that revolution occurs and is successful, America, or the United States, really sets off on an experiment of how then do a bunch of different colonies who have united together to win a war. How do they form a new country? And in fact, it takes a couple attempts. The first attempt with the article is something called the Articles of Confederation, which is kind of a weak central government. It is seen largely as a failure, and so they dump it and they write a new set of government regulations, a new constitution, which we call the Constitution of the United States, and it really lays out a government based on Enlightenment ideas, limited government, separation of powers, emphasis on popular sovereignty and the involvement, the ability of people to vote for representatives, this creating what was called a democratic republic. As part of the compromise for creating the Constitution, they create a Bill of Rights that guarantees that all citizens of the United States have certain rights that the government cannot infringe upon, like the right to freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, the right to a trial by jury of your peers, things that people really saw as enshrining protections from government itself. Because remember, these ideas of the Enlightenment really saw that power should come from the people, or the power of government comes from the people, and the government should really be limited in what they can do. And that the most important thing was the protection of individual rights. Now, with all of these revolutions, we might ask a question of really how revolutionary are they? The American Revolution is pretty interesting, and there can be a lot of debate there. There's certainly a change in how a government runs and who's in charge. But largely, this was a revolution that was more political than it was social. Before the revolution, the people in charge of government were typically wealthy landowners, wealthy planter class. After the revolution, it's still that group. The rights for women do not grow terribly. Now, women play a major role in the revolution, not just producing goods that can no longer be traded for or gotten from Britain, but they also play a role in supporting the war effort. They are seen as important for instilling ideas of republicanism, or this kind of new in these enlightened ideas, education in children. But except for maybe a brief period of time in New Jersey, I think women are not given the right to vote, for example. Slavery exists before the war, and it exists after the war. The United States does not do away with that, even though the Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal. It did not come to fruition that it applied to everyone. So the United States, we can think of maybe more as a political revolution. But how revolutionary was it? Socially, maybe not as much. Donald mentioned here that it's an interesting revolution because it doesn't go to the extremes of the French or Haitian revolutions, and that's what we're going to get into next. And that is certainly the case. The American Revolution does not end up with kind of an extreme arm of it. The French Revolution is a little different. Now, and again, this is different from the American Revolution in that the American Revolution is fought against an outside government, a colonial power. The French Revolution is from internally. It's fought against the monarchy of France, or the nobility of France. Now, this image, this political cartoon, is a really great example of this, and it is displaying what were the three estates of France. So, French society was divided into three social classes. The first estate being the clergy. Those were the religious hierarchy of France. The second estate being the nobility. And those were those who had noble birth, the kings, dukes, barons, whoever, of France. And these two groups made up the smallest group of the smallest part of the French population. So pretty small, but they had most of the power in France. In fact, and they often allied together. The nobility, the France in total was controlled by the king, right? An absolute monarchy. King being a noble himself. But what this cartoon is showing is that there is a third estate. There is everybody else who is not noble, not clergy. And this involved people who were the poorest of the poor peasants, all the way up to extremely wealthy merchants and traders and educated elites known as the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie saw themselves as really carrying the nobility and the clergy, because the nobility and the clergy were taxed a minuscule amount or not at all. And the money that was generated, or the taxes that were generated in France, came from that third estate, that lowest class of France. Now, the French Revolution really comes out of an economic crisis. And what happens, or what we see happen, is that the Estates General, the French king, has to call together this representative body of all three estates. The third estate, feeling that they are going to be outvoted by the first two estates, even though they are the minority in the country, protest. And they basically march out and they resolve to form a national assembly in France. And this kind of kicks off the French Revolution. I'm not going to go into all of the details, but the French king, basically worried about this National Assembly, tries to go and have these people arrested. The French people storm the Bastille of France, really in protest, trying to make sure that the French military doesn't, suppress this revolution. And what comes out of this is ultimately a short-lived constitutional monarchy. The French king is kind of forced to move into Paris from his palace at Versailles, so they can keep an eye on him. He is kind of forced to go along with these changes that the National Assembly is bringing about. However, there is a radical turn of this revolution, especially when it is found out that the king is trying to escape France to go to Austria, where some of the king's wives' relatives live, in perhaps, as the thinking was, conspire with Austria to then march back into France and reestablish the king on the throne, back in power. Of course, what this results in is the king being tried for treason. He and the queen have their heads chopped off, really just sparking what is called the Reign of Terror in France, a radical movement. What was called the Committee of Public Safety basically takes control of France at the time. eliminating anyone they believe to be an enemy of the revolution, or any monarchists, anyone who supports the monarchy. It was kind of squarely in the sights of this reign of terror. It takes some time, but eventually the pendulum swings the other way, and the leader of the reign of terror is himself put to death, officially kind of ending this era where thousands of people are killed for being enemies of the revolution. Now, during this whole time, France is at war with outlying areas. In fact, the plot with Austria, or perceived plot, kind of leads to France fighting a war with them. And out of these wars comes a pretty well-known young man who's a great leader, this guy Napoleon. And out of this kind of instability in France, as Napoleon starts to win battles and kind of French pride starts to grow, they turn to him for stability. And so as this French Revolution, kind of the main parts of it come to a close, Napoleon kind of establishes order in France, eventually becoming the leader of France, then being declared consul, kind of harkening back to the Roman days, and then consul for life, and then eventually emperor of a French empire in Europe, which he will be in charge of until 1815 when he falls. Now, what does this mean for the French Revolution? We talked about how revolutionary was the American Revolution. Well, how revolutionary is the French Revolution? The French Revolution, it starts with an absolute monarchy. It ends with an emperor, which you might say, well, that's not very revolutionary at all. But it completely upends the social system of France. It abolishes the three estates. What we saw earlier, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, is an extremely important document, which really does enshrine some basic beliefs about what it means to have what freedoms should be protected in France. And even though perhaps the political aspect of it doesn't work out, eventually once Napoleon falls, a king is put back on the throne of France. But the spirit of that French Revolution, the nationalism that develops, the ideas of the French Revolution will live on. And the old estate system is done away with. So while the American Revolution may have been more of a success politically, but may not have had the social change that maybe some would have liked to see, the French Revolution is not totally the opposite, but quite different. Much more social change in France, a spirit of revolution, spirit of nationalism, which will spread across Europe and result in some other revolutions we're not going to talk about today. But politically, the argument you made, they went in a full revolution, right? Revolution needs to go around. They kind of ended back where they came from. All right. Now, an offshoot of this French Revolution, and certainly something that is impacted by the American Revolution as well, as they looked at an example of this happening in the Americas, is the Haitian Revolution. And this is one that I think you especially need to know when you are thinking about these Atlantic revolutions. Haiti is the second country in the Western Hemisphere to gain independence. It is the United States is the first, Haiti being the second. Haiti was a French colony, and it grew mostly sugarcane using slave labor in brutal conditions on plantations. Now, the French Revolution does spark the Haitian Revolution. The French Revolution, for example, declares that these social systems should be abolished. It talks about equality among men. It talks about natural rights. And in fact, at one point, the French Revolution, the French government bans slavery, abolishes it, which, of course, slaves in Haiti are like, yes, slavery's horrible. We should rise up against the people who are in charge of us. So the slaves in Haiti begin rising up in revolt. back in 1791, just a few years into the French Revolution. It is led by a guy named Toussaint Louverture, and he leads an army of slaves in a fight against French planters and their allies. And by 1798, about 7 years in, the rebels had succeeded in totally abolishing slavery on the island, and Toussaint's forces controlled much of the island itself. Now, the revolution was not entirely finished by that point, because by the time you get around to 1798, France and their turmoil, which the Haitian Revolution was able to take advantage of, they start to gain some stability as Napoleon, yes, that very same Napoleon we were just talking about, comes to power. And in 1802, Napoleon sends a large army back to Haiti to not only reconquer the island, but to re-enslave Haitians there. But again, under the leadership of Toussaint, the Haitians take up arms and they fight. Toussaint is eventually captured, taken to France, put in prison where he dies. And the struggle continued for about 2 more years in Haiti before they finally defeated the French in 1803. They were able to declare full independence in 1804, and the French, or the Haitian, what will become a republic later on, the Republic of Haiti, will be this again the second country in the Western Hemisphere to successfully throw off a European power. And what's so significant about this Haitian Revolution is not only was it a political success, it completely upended the social system. This radical change as slaves themselves rise up and gain independence. Is an example of a successful slave revolt, which were very few and far between. Most slave resistance was done in other ways, some which was not successful, some which was moderately successful. We look at maroon societies. We're not going to get into that today. But this was a really an example of something that could, a revolution that completely upended the way things were. Now, here's the downside to that. The Haitian Revolution was extremely destructive. And the Haitian economy, can be argued, really never fully recovers from this war. And even today, Haiti is one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. And a lot of that has to do with the destruction of this war, farming practices in Haiti, and sugarcane farming. So, in the long term, Haiti has had to deal with a lot of the ramifications of this after a kind of a period of prosper afterwards. But nevertheless, very significant revolution to keep in mind when we're thinking in terms of these Atlantic revolutions. And Donald, mentions something important here. If we think about a connection to U.S. history, France getting beat in Haiti really just makes them not really want to deal with the Americas anymore. And so after regaining Louisiana from Spain, who they had to give it to after the 7 Years' War, they decide, you know what, we'll sell all of Louisiana to the United States. That's something you'll study if you take APUSH. All right, so from there, I want to kind of give a brief overview of revolutions in Latin America. So similar to the revolutions of North America, the American Revolution itself, and perhaps different from what we see in Haiti, the revolutions in Latin America are led primarily by kind of a wealthy class. And we call that class, especially in Spanish South America, the Creoles. So the Creoles were European descendants. And in this really high, this hierarchy of race-based social hierarchy found in Latin America, the Creoles were kind of second tier. You had the Peninsulares, they were Spanish, pure Spanish, but born back in Europe. And you have this Creole class who are born in the Americas, but are quite wealthy. It is this class, this educated, wealthy class, from which revolution will come as they kind of form a coalition against the Spanish powers. Now, revolution in Latin America, especially in Spanish South America, which we're going to talk about first, it is primarily led by the person you see pictured here, Simón Bolívar. And this also kind of comes out of these Napoleonic Wars. The armies of Napoleon invade the Iberian Peninsula and occupy Spain. And in that kind of window of opportunity, Simón Bolívar organizes an uprising that establishes a republic in Venezuela in South America. And Bolivar faced many challenges to his power in Venezuela, but he's ultimately able to cement control. And then he marches his army through South America, through Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, basically pushing the Spanish out of the region and taking over this region, eventually uniting some of the regions of northern South America into what is called Gran Colombia. And there, as he pushed the Spanish out of the region, he meets another revolutionary, Jose de San Martin, who is doing the same thing kind of from the southern part of South America, moving to the north, eventually gaining independence for Argentina. Bolivar and San Martin kind of meet. San Martin turns command of his army over to Bolivar in 1822, and he continues and kind of finishes this push of Europeans out of, or of the Spanish out of South America. By 1824, the South American wars for independence were over. Bolivar united lands into some of the lands that he had conquered into a singular nation called Gran Colombia, which consisted of Colombia, Panama at the time, I believe, Venezuela, and Ecuador. And it will stay united until his death, and then it'll break apart into several countries. There certainly are going to be some struggles kind of after independence for South American countries, struggle for power. There are going to be several civil wars that are found throughout these South American countries over time. But nevertheless, Bolivar rallies the people, as you saw in the Jamaica letter, against these oppressive governments, right? That are he likens their treatment of these colonists or these colonies to slavery, which I'm sure the Haitians would disagree with. But he uses that as the rallying cry. Their rights are being denied, and so they must rise up and take control of their land. Again, seeing the example of the Americans, seeing the example of Haiti, and taking advantage of what's going on in Europe. Now, the revolution in Mexico, I'm going to go over this real quick, is somewhat similar. Mexico was actually Spain's richest and most populous colony. After seeing the revolts in Haiti, many people in Spanish America and in Mexico weren't sure that they wanted that drastic of a change. But in Mexico, when the opportunity presented itself after Napoleon invaded Spain, there is a push for independence. That independence push actually starts with a parish priest, a guy named Father Hidalgo, who urged the Mexican people to rise up against Spanish authorities, and there starts to be a kind of a violent rebellion, which fizzles out as people in charge, even the local governments or the local powers, are not really the Creole class doesn't necessarily support this lower class rebellion, mainly because they sort of turn against the Creoles somewhat. But I don't want to get in the weeds. Not long after, about a decade later, and by 1820s, there is still some disagreement between what's going on in Mexico and what's going on in Spain. And a guy named Colonel Agustin de Iturbide raises an army and eventually overthrows the Spanish government and declares Mexican independence. by 1823, Mexico becomes a republic. I have here to talk about Brazil. There's not much to say about Brazil, I guess. I don't really know why I put that in here. To be honest, it's not really a outright rebellion. When Napoleon invades Portugal, the king flees to Brazil. When he goes back to Portugal, he leaves his son in charge, and eventually, under pressure from the planter class, he declares independence for Brazil. That's the quick and dirty of that one, because I don't really know why I included it. So, as my voice is giving out here, and we're coming to the end, even though I'm going long here, and I apologize for going over our hour together, I just get too excited about this topic. And sometimes when I'm told to do an overview, I don't just give a brief overview, apparently. But I do want to give you an opportunity to practice or something to think about. And so oftentimes when these revolutions come up on the AP exam, it's asking you to compare aspects of these revolutions. Whether it be the outcomes of the revolution, maybe comparing social and political outcomes of these revolutions, or maybe even the causes of them. And so here I've written an SAQ practice that you can think about and write about similarities and differences in the causes of these revolutions. And I picked the American and French Revolution because I knew I was going to spend the most time probably on those revolutions. So this SAQ says for you to explain one similarity in the causes of the American and French revolutions, to explain another similarity in the causes of the American and French revolution. So you have to identify two similarities there and give that full explanation. Again, that word explain means that you have to tell how or why these causes were similar between the two. So I basically state what the cause was, cite evidence that it occurred in both the American and French Revolution, and explain how they relate. And then explain, for point C, explain one difference in the causes of the American and French revolutions. So if I'm thinking about this question, anytime I think about the causes of Atlantic revolutions, the first thing that should pop up in our minds is the Enlightenment. Don't forget that obvious. There was, back in 2016, one of the LEQs was basically this: similarities and differences in the causes of revolutions. And my students came back to me, and they did very well on the test, but they came back, and we talked about it a few days later when the question became public, and we were going through all these different similarities of the causes of these revolutions. And I said, all right, how many of you wrote about the Enlightenment? And it was such an obvious answer that some people even forgot the obvious. So don't forget the obvious. The Enlightenment. How did the Enlightenment lead to the American and French revolutions? Think about these documents, these statements of purpose, these statements of revolution, right? How does that relate? The Enlightenment influencing the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which stated that the power of government comes from the consent of the governed, right? And if they felt that the government was not protecting, since they felt the government not protecting their rights, they rebelled. Another similarity that you can bring in is issues of perhaps taxation. Of course, there's many more, but just to kind of get you rolling on this, the American colonists felt that they were having to pay taxes without adequate representation in British Parliament. Their rallying cry was no taxation without representation. So, think about those similarities. If you can think of any others, throw them up in the chat right now. Let's kind of go through those. We can parse through any other similarities you can come up with. But the American taxes in France, the issue also became taxation, right? The idea that the third estate was paying the bulk of the taxes in France, and felt that they were paying an undue burden since the first and second estate were not paying taxes in France, right? And so that unjust tax system, perhaps taxation again without representation or without equal representation, is one of the catalysts for the French Revolution, just as it was with the American Revolution. So, you can just kind of brainstorm these when you get into writing your SAQs and try to pick out those similarities. One difference, right? If we want to brainstorm differences in these revolutions, you can focus on perhaps the social causes of the French Revolution, which were not necessarily present in the American Revolution, the focus on class differences, perhaps the situation of the American Revolution fighting against an external colonial power, where the French Revolution was fighting against an internal absolutist government, right? Those by kind of those causes being kind of distinctly different and unique to each of these situations. Now, this question, you could change out any revolution one for another. You could compare the American and the Haitian, or the French and the Haitian revolutions, right? Or the Latin American revolutions. The Enlightenment is going to be a cause for all of them. But let's say we threw in the Haitian Revolution here, major difference, of course, between, let's say, the French and Haitian revolutions would be that the Haitian Revolution was a revolution of slaves, of the lowest of the low classes, whereas the bourgeoisie, kind of the upper middle class of France, led their revolution. Similarity might be still a desire for social equality, for the realization of individual rights, and of course, the Enlightenment. So think about that question and ways that it might be posed differently. And you can challenge yourself with this, making charts comparing similarities and differences in causes, effects, events of these revolutions. And that's, I think, a really good way to study and prepare. It has been a few years now, 3 or 4 years, since there's been an LEQ, DBQ, or SAQ on these Atlantic revolutions. It has never popped up. I was looking through, at least in the public exams, it has not popped up as an SAQ, which I think it might be due to bring that in again, especially in this AP World Modern course. There's probably going to be more emphasis on these revolutions. So I think it's something really, really good to study. I had one more image here, but we just really don't have time for it. Take a look at it. George Washington as a Roman general. This again was just going to be kind of a last kind of image analysis of the connection of these revolutions to the Enlightenment, the neoclassical tradition, kind of looking at the Enlightenment as an heir to the Greco-Roman traditions. And here, George Washington being portrayed in the style of a Roman general really harkens back to that in that neoclassical style. If you have any more questions, I certainly will answer them. We did have one question earlier about in the question section about, were there other revolutions in the Caribbean besides the Haitian? And the answer is yes. But really the only major successful revolution we're going to see is the Haitian, at least in the time period we talked about today. The Dominican Republic would be next. They would declare independence from Haiti. There were other rebellions, some successful, some not, as well as Eric mentioned there, and I mentioned briefly earlier, maroon societies that you could perhaps see as successful. In fact, some of the maroon societies, which were societies of escaped slaves, they even signed treaties with Europeans. For example, there's a famous Maroon Society in Jamaica that kept raiding British settlements until the British government signed a peace treaty with them, recognizing their ability to kind of live off on their own as long as they stopped raiding Britain or these British settlements in Jamaica. So some really fascinating stuff if you look up Maroon Societies. And then Donald has some really good suggestions there, thinking about Caribbean revolutions outside of this time period too. And that is something that will definitely come up in this course now that we can spend more time on these modern eras. So really great question. And if y'all have any more, I'll certainly answer them. It has been a wonderful time to be with you. I know I went long today, an hour and 20 minutes almost. So my deepest apologies. Definitely want you to get some sleep today. Come back tomorrow, though, because we have a couple really great live reviews with you. Donald, who's been in the chat today, Competing Empires at 8. Eric with Decolonizing the Age of Revolution is a good sequel to today's, where he can go into a lot more detail about these revolutions and talk to you about them. That's at 9 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. So some really great content that we have for you, and we hope it's helpful. We hope you'll share this with your classmates, with your friends who you may know taking this course at other places. If you're a part of any of the online AP World History student communities, be sure to share. Let them know that they have the opportunity to come and see these things free. And then if they would like to join to get access to all the ones that we've been doing, they can certainly join Fiveable. But we want to make sure to get this out there to whoever needs it. So thank you so much for joining with us tonight. I don't see any other questions popping up, so I'll just go ahead and say goodnight and perhaps rest this sick voice I have. It was wonderful being with you. Hope you have a great day, and we will see you tomorrow here on Fiveable. And thank you, Ching Long. I do hope I feel better too, because it is not fun being sick. Have a great night.